All right, everybody, welcome to another live episode of the Mike Sennello Show for August the 3rd, 2021. Tonight's theme is, of course, as the title has indicated, keep electing Democrats. And we're going to start right here in our hometown in New Milford with a wild exchange from the last town council meeting between Councilman Nahom and our health director. Then we'll expand our view to include Hartford, where we recently appointed a King-for-Life. And finally, we'll bring it on back home to talk about the local elections that are going to be going on here in November, and specifically touch up on the candidacy of Democratic mayoral hopeful Ted Hine. We got some big news at the end, so stay tuned. Like I said, real big news coming up as far as where we're going with this show. And of course, we'll cap with some Q&A. So get those questions in the chat, and I'll get to them as soon as I possibly can. But first, like I said, we're going to start off right here in New Milford with this insane exchange from the last town council meeting, which was on Monday, September 27th. And the exchange is between Mike Nahom and Lisa Morrissey. And as far as Mike is concerned, Mike, I don't know if you're going to be watching or if you are watching, but you may have just won my vote with this single exchange. And as far as Lisa Morrissey is concerned, this is not meant to be a dig at Lisa Morrissey herself, but the comments in this particular exchange, which you'll see throughout the course of this exchange. The reason I really want to go over this is because it's emblematic of how the COVID conversation in general is going. And it allows us to have some real insight as to how this whole thing is playing out from a political standpoint, and on the theme of keep electing Democrats. And keep in mind, too, because I've got a ton of videos to pull in, a ton of excerpts to pull in. So keep in mind that this entire time, Mike Nahom is walking on eggshells. He's not blasting Lisa or anyone else in the room with the toughest of questions. He's not being combative in any way. He's utterly softballing this whole situation. So to provide some context before we go into this conversation, so for those who didn't watch the town council meeting or didn't attend the town council meeting from the 27th, so we're clear, Director Morrissey is presenting the COVID update from the position of director of the health department. And she's also missed the last two meetings. So Mike Nahom, if he wanted to, could have just raked her over the coals and have said some things, honestly, that if he was to be as forward as I think he would like to be, probably would have gotten the stream canceled because of the guidance from YouTube and because of Susan WikiWiki's because of the way that YouTube handles COVID and how everyone has to walk on eggshells unless they just kowtow and bow down to a single political ideology in that respect. So with that out of the way, that's the context for this whole conversation, that this is the health director's presentation to the town council. This is the one opportunity the town council has as a body to directly engage with the director. And again, she's missed the last two meetings. So it's incredibly useful to have these sort of conversations and to ask these difficult questions. And again, these are softball questions that Mike brings up. These are not hard hitting. And the first question that Mike raises in this first series of exchanges is around the idea of why are we not talking about getting folks in shape? Mike Nahom asks that question thusly.
This is something that, and I'm just talking to you because you're here, but I know it's not you. Why do we not talk about strengthening the immune system to get, I mean, you hear vague stuff about it, but it's not pushed and it's not really talked about that, the number one comorbidity for people that die of COVID is the overweight or diabetes or things that they can actually affect by getting in shape and getting stronger. So I've always wondered why it's not talked about at all, and it seems like it's something we should be talking about at this meeting every day, to the kids, to everybody, that get yourself in shape so if you do get COVID or something does happen, you can fight it off better.
Okay, so that wasn't like the most hard-hitting question he could have asked, and correct. Nothing he said is incorrect. This is 100% something we should be pushing. We should be pushing mitigation efforts. And Mike is 100% correct to say that this has not even been mentioned. And it will be admitted later on in this video. You'll see how it is admitted that in these meetings, this is the very first time that anyone has said anything about mitigation. To me, this is a great question. And again, it's a pretty softball question. So what was Director Morrissey's response? This was the response.
So I think those conversations are happening. They're happening at the national, state,
Where?
and local level in public health and the healthcare sectors. I would say some of the biggest challenges, that's a part of your long-term strategy, not an immediate, and we're still in the acute stages. And when we talk about that, then you have to address access to healthcare, equity, and access to the funds to make those programs a reality.
Equity access to healthcare, funding for put down the fork and strap on the running shoes. What? Where? First things first, we need to address where on earth are we hearing any of this? Why have I not seen any of this at any level? Why has no one I've known seen any of this? Citation needed. Right? If you're going to make this positive claim, then the burden of proof is, of course, on you to prove the positive claim. But I have yet to hear anything come out of Lisa Morrissey's mouth, out of Dr. Levin's mouth. I've yet to hear anything come out of Dr. Fauci's mouth. I've yet to hear anything come out of Ned Lamont's mouth, or any of the guidance that's come from Ned Lamont. I rarely ever hear any mention whatsoever, and it's a passing mention at best from the CDC. I don't know where she's hearing this. I don't know where she's hearing this. We are 2 years in. We absolutely should be talking about mitigation here. We absolutely should be talking about mitigation, and this is the first time. This is the first time in almost 2 years of this stuff that we're hearing any talk of it, at the very least in the town council meeting. As far as access to healthcare is concerned, he's talking about eating less and exercising more. What on earth do you mean by access to healthcare in this case? Who can't not eat more, right? Who in the world can't just put the fork down and eat a little less and exercise a little more? For whom is this an utter impossibility? And as far as equity is concerned, I would love an honest answer. What the hell do you mean by equity? Is this just some sort of dog whistle for some sort of CRT-based, obviously racist policy? Now, I'm going to give you, we're going to extend the principle of charity here and say that that's not what we're talking about here. But honest question, who can't lace up and go for a run or for a walk at the very least? Who can't do that? What are we talking about here? As far as funding is concerned, again, for heaven's sake, I'll volunteer my company, Taylor Media. I will volunteer my company to help you spread the word if that's what it takes. Telling people to put the fork down and lace up the running shoes can't possibly cost even close to what the genuinely billions upon billions of dollars that we spent on vaccinations. And by the way, as far as the claim that we're still purely in the acute phases, at what point in 2 years, what is becoming more and more just a seasonal condition, at what point do we start talking about long-term goals here? At what point do we start talking about mitigation efforts? At what point do we start talking about the long term? So far, it hasn't been mentioned. And if Mike Nahom hadn't brought it up, then it wouldn't have gotten mentioned. So good on Nahom for pointing this out. And Nahom continues that, you don't want to be a statistic.
Well, getting up in the morning and going for a half-hour walk there's no money involved in that. And this pandemic, the first time weighing down in March of last year, people had a summer there to get ready, and a lot of people didn't. Next thing you know, we had another problem come winter, and another summer. We've had the time. It's definitely time to do it. We've had a lot, and as I said, I'm not blaming you. Everyone here, can look in the mirror and say, you know what, I really need to strengthen my body so that if I do get sick, I don't become a statistic.
Damn right, Nahom. Damn right. We've already seen, and he's 100% right, we've already seen long-term seasonality in this whole thing. We've already seen how you can actually predict, just in the matter of time of year in certain places, where you're going to see spikes. Where on that calendar you're going to see spikes. We have repeatedly talked about how in these meetings, how COVID is basically just here to stay. These are the words that have already basically been uttered by Lisa Morrissey herself in these meetings. These are words that have explicitly been uttered by Mayor Bass, and when reciting her reports when she hasn't been able to attend, and of course by Dr. Jeremy Levin. It is time to talk about mitigation. It is time to talk about long-term plans. And again, these are just softball questions. Mike Nahom could have laid down the hammer and didn't. And by the way, these are all things that she agrees with by her own admission. Pete Bass read her report at the last town council meeting when she wasn't able to attend. Jeremy Levin said the exact same thing at the previous town council meeting, not the 27th, but the one before that. She's implied this on a fairly routine basis for some time now, that COVID is just here to stay and it's going to take months, if not years, rather than it's already over or it's going to take days, if not weeks. Why do you think, and for the, I mean, on that, why do you think everyone's wearing masks despite everyone in the room being vaccinated? Right? The whole idea is that it's here to stay. The whole idea is that it's just becoming a part of life that we're going to have to deal with. And if it's becoming a part of life that we have to deal with, then we have to talk about mitigation strategies. These are things that we should be considering. If it's just going to become part of your everyday life, then you should work dealing with COVID into your everyday routine, as in exercise. And again, I mean, this whole notion that there's no good program for a walk. Mike Nahom is dead on right to point this out. No program for a walk. Go Mike Nahom.
And your first statement of we need a program for it. There's no program to go for a walk.
I would be a poor health director if I didn't address the statement that you made that it doesn't take anything to do that 30 minutes. Not everyone has sidewalks, and it's safe in their neighborhood to go for a walk. And so your statements make the assumption that everybody has access to a neighborhood where they can safely go for a walk a half hour before, or they don't have obligations to a family or a job. That makes that more difficult. So those are part of the things in public health that we look at when we talk about access.
Seriously, are you kidding me? Are you actually kidding me? This is New Milford, home of the famous New Milford cross-country program. Easily the best program in the entire state. One of the best programs in all of New England, if not the best. And a nationally renowned cross-country team. And you're talking to cross-country legend Mike Nahom, who just today won a road race. Today won a road race. He's in his 50s now. Again, this is the worst person to be making these claims to in terms of Mike Nahom. Like, everyone has access. The notion, you're talking to somebody who knows exactly what it takes to get into unbelievable running shape. You're talking to somebody who has got to know where the great running spots are in Milford, which, by the way, they're all over the place. As far as everyone has access to it, not everyone has access to a neighborhood where they can safely go for a walk. Again, this is New Milford. This is New Milford. I was on the cross-country team myself. I still go running to this day. I don't run at nearly the pace I used to, and I certainly don't run at nearly the pace that Mike Nahom does, but are you kidding me? The 8 Mile Road Race is a famous course because you can run it even when those sections of road aren't sectioned off for the race. Mayoral Road is a fine road to go running on. West Meeting House is a fine road to go running on, as evidenced by the fact that dozens of people run there daily when the weather is good, right? There's like an endless number of good roads to go running on that don't have sidewalk. River Road is a famous spot to go running on. When I used to live on Taylor Terrace, I used to go run laps around Taylor Terrace. It's 0.6 of a mile. It's a brutal 0.6 of a mile because it's basically just a hill workout. There's no sidewalks there. That's a fine neighborhood to go running in. And by the way, if you don't live in one of those neighborhoods, go downtown. If you got to run at night, I used to run at night downtown, where we have excellent lighting, where we have excellent sidewalks, where you can do like a 1 mile zigzag loop, zigzagging up and down, East Street, Main Street back, and then down to Railroad Street, maybe even crossing Bridge Street over and up into down into the South Main District. And that's just the roads. I haven't even touched up on Northville or Gaylord. So when I was on the cross-country team, we used to go to Pumpkin Hill Road off of Erickson and run our hills there. We used to run, there's a great run that starts off at Lover's Leap, and you run down to the Bridgewater Town Park and back. Excellent run. Nobody ever drives on that road. A scenic route, little bit of hills, little bit of flat, pretty well-maintained pathway. You get to see, you could stop at the lookout on the way back if you'd like, when there's only like 200, 300 yards to go. For that matter, all the parks we have. Harrybrook Park is an excellent park to go running in. Sega Meadows is an excellent park to go running in. Carlson's Grove, although it's not a very big park, you can go running in the roads around that and through that park. I used to do a hill run. My hill climb used to be, I would start at Carlson's Grove and I would go up the famous Churchill Road run up into Ridge Road. And if I really felt ambitious, I'd go from Church Road past that down to 109. You have got to be kidding me. This is New Milford. There's a reason that our cross-country program is so good. We don't really have, for all intents and purposes, a feeder program like the wrestling team has, where they're starting at 8 years old. No, we just have great running roads. And Mike Nahum isn't even talking about going for a run the way that I used to, and he does. I'm sorry, this whole access notion, if they have access to wherever the shots are being administered, say Pettibone, they have access to a place where they can go for a walk. Because quite frankly, there's a ton of fields there. It's a boring run, but you could just do laps around the fields over at Pettibone. You could just include the dog run there. That's the dog park that's over there, and go around the dog park. You could, if you wanted, go down Pickett District. Pickett District, for a huge extent of that road, really isn't that bad a road to go running down. I mean, I would personally turn off at Cedar Knolls and go running in that neighborhood instead, because it starts to get narrow and windy as that road gets closer to the traffic circle. But you have got to be kidding me. If you have access to wherever the shots are being administered, then you have access to a place where you can go for a walk. And of course, this whole idea, obligations to a family or job that makes that more difficult. Do they have time out of their day to go get the shot? Then they have time out of the day to go for a run. However long it takes to go get the shot, go for a walk, go for a run, walk the dog. Yes, it's these things that are hard to do that define us. This is a good thing, right? Like, I know it's mentally difficult to do things to do the things that we need to actually do. The easy way out is, for all intents and purposes, the morally abject way to do it, right? It's just because it's hard doesn't mean you shouldn't be encouraging it, especially if it's a matter of pure willpower to do the thing. I mean, for crying out loud, get out of bed in the morning. And Nahum is, again, correct to call this just an excuse.
Yeah, I understand. I'm not blaming you, but that's just another excuse to not be able to get a half hour to your day. I know what busy is. I own 2 businesses. I coach track at the high school. I'm on the council here. I'm a nonprofit. And I still find, at 5 o'clock, I got my headlight and I'm walking my dogs in the morning. So I understand. As I said, and by your statements, it doesn't seem like it's a priority in this country, in this town, in this state, to get people stronger so that if they do get sick, they can get by. And I'm not saying it's only you, but being the health director, health isn't just recovering from COVID. Health is
correct.
Help make yourself stronger so you do get COVID. Correct.
Mitigation is a real thing. And as a health director, this is something that 100% should be talked about. And remember, folks, the theme here is keep electing Democrats. And on that theme, of course, Mary Jane Lundgren has to jump in and deflect and give us, yet again, the Helen Lovejoy appeal to emotion and use anecdotes in a conversation about risk calculation. Go ahead, Mary Jane.
I'd just like to say, I hear where you're coming from, except that there have been thousands of people who have died that are exceptionally healthy. They're athletes, they've been exercising, they've been doing everything.
Statistically speaking, that is not true, though. Maybe
it is true.
Maybe anecdotal. No,
it's true.
They list the comorbidities, and that's not.
So
you
cannot just say because somebody is diabetic, overweight, or hypertensive that they're it does definitely affect their risk factors of how they're going to recover.
That's all I'm getting at. It affects the risk factors.
We are dealing with a very deadly disease that each person's immune system responds in a different manner. And you can be a very healthy person and you will still lose your life. And we have seen it.
So we shouldn't talk about that.
No, I'm not saying that, but
Yes, you are. I'm sorry, Mary Jane, but not sorry. You are saying that. Who are you trying to kid, Mary Jane? And of course, again, just because you don't use those exact words doesn't mean that's not the obvious point you're intimating. Why would you even bring up this appeal to these thousands of people who are supposedly in an implicitly Mike Nahum level condition, who are dying in direct response to what Nahum said about getting in shape, which you prefaced this statement with, if not as a way of saying you shouldn't be talking about this? Of course, this is what she's talking about. And of course, you'd think the reasonable people in the room would have Mike's back in all of this, but nope.
Excuse me, Mike, let's cede the floor for a minute. I have to say, since Lisa came here, I've been working very closely with her, partly because we had to with the COVID. but I've gotten to know her, and I know her background, and she's more than qualified, uber qualified, and has many, many certificates and degrees. She's very well educated on the state of our nation, not just our town, and COVID and general health. So while I think what you said is a good point, there are many, and when you look at what happens with COVID, we can't solve that here. And if it is a certain priority for you, I think you should go forward and try to do what you can or gather people with you. That's how this change occurs. But I don't think we can do
He's
it
doing that.
tonight while we do have a rather long agenda. And
The only point I said is it hasn't been mentioned at all since we started here at these meetings. And
well,
these
now
are
it
updates
has.
from-
Thank you.
What?
And now it has been. Thank you.
All right.
Oh, even Nahum had to do a double take there. That was fellow Republican Katie Francis jerking the chain here, right? Reeling things in, not even reeling things in, saying, no more, Mike. Stop this conversation. This is the health director's presentation. Mike is bringing up a point that ought to be discussed, and Katie's refusing to allow him to do that. Well, not refusing to allow him to do it, but saying he shouldn't be doing this. And for the most ridiculous of reasons, too. What, is this, like, is she accusing him of grandstanding or something? Again, it's not grandstanding when you're talking about a point that absolutely should be brought up under the context of a conversation where this is the point. So, and what? This whole notion that now it has been? No. He's facing a rejection from the health director. He's facing a rejection from the DTC chair, and he's not getting any support from Republicans. He's lone wolfing this. So no, it's really not him bringing it up when if he just mutters it under his breath and everyone's like, boo that man. That's what are we talking about here, right? If you want him to go rally the troops, that's what he's doing. What other place is he supposed to be bringing this up and having this conversation and having this exchange? But of course, folks, it doesn't get better. If you thought that line of questioning was bad, where all he's talking about is mitigation efforts, where all Mike Nahum is saying, and he said it repeatedly, all he wants to do is say, listen, we should be talking about mitigation efforts. We should be talking about losing weight and getting in shape. We should be talking about promoting well-being and health during the health director's presentation, right? Like that is the easiest softball I could possibly think of, but that's not. But like, and again, Mike Nahum could be bringing up a much harder point, and we see that as like I said, things don't get better; they get much worse. And if you thought that line of questioning was bad about the exercise, wait till they start talking about kids. Go, Mike Nahum.
I've heard, and you hear so many different things, that children aren't passing as much as adults because they don't get it as bad. Is that true, or is that?
So that is a statement that was really prevalent in 2020, and it's less so now. And the reason why it was such a prevalent theory at the time was because we weren't seeing the case numbers. But we weren't seeing the case numbers because we weren't testing kids at the same rate. What we're seeing now that we're testing children in much higher rates, is that kids are getting COVID-19 and they are able to spread it. And if you look at any of our urban populations, what you tend to find is that once one person, and it's typically a child, brings it into the household, it spreads throughout the house. And then you see more severe cases in multi-generational households. I'll say that here in New Milford, and Pete and I have talked about this a couple of times, particularly over the summer, what we would find, all it took was one sleepover. It would be one sleepover, and then all the kids that attended it, they took it back home with them, and then the whole household. And what would have been 2 cases now turned into 4 houses with COVID-19. And I was literally watching the days, and over the course of 7 days, it went from just being the child who attended the sleepover to the household for the child. So that is typical to what we're seeing, not just here in New Milford, across the region, the state, and the country. If you test for it, you're gonna find it, Mike. So that statement doesn't hold as much weight as it did a year ago.
And that's a wonderful answer to a question he didn't ask. Is it possible for kids to get and transmit COVID-19? Nobody's ever denied that. Mike's question was about the rate. He gives you an out, and the out isn't taken, right? The question, what we care about is the rate. Is it much lower? And the reason it's reasonable to ask that question is because Dr. Levin mentioned this just a few weeks ago. So unless something has completely changed in the last few weeks, I would love to see that data. I would love to hear you. I will take you at your word, whatever the rate is. I would be happy to concede the point if the rate was even addressed. It wasn't. I'll say that this is just kind of a lead in to get things primed for this conversation about vaccinating and masking kids. But this point is really not that big a deal. If I'm being honest, this could just be a language slip up. She may even, this could be just something where if she had actually said instead, yeah, we're seeing that the rate is the same, I'll concede the point. And it may have been just a slip up to talk about in the absolute rather than in relative terms. She may just simply have been nervous at the podium to a certain degree, but hey, I wouldn't know. She's got a mask covering her face. And, we could easily just shrug this off, but things wind up getting a lot darker when we start talking about outcomes with kids and vaccinations. Again, Nahum is softballing this and is willing to concede an argument for vaccinating kids. He's willing to apply the principle of charity here. We know that this is not only coming from a position of good faith. Again, Mike Nahum isn't being as callous and he isn't being as difficult as he possibly could with his line of questioning. And this is how it winds up going. Here's Nahum explaining everything I just said and how the death rate is, quote, pretty low. So
the main reason then that we're talking about vaccinating someone that's 5 or 6 where the death rate is extremely small and long-term issues are small is because we don't want them to breed so we can protect the adult population.
So no,
because it is. For a 5-year-old, the death rate is pretty low.
This is all true. This is all reasonable. The death rate is incredibly low. We talked about this 2 episodes ago. You guys can look on my channel. I've gone over the COVID statistics when it comes to kids several times. When Mike Nahum says it's pretty low, that is a major softball. That is him walking on eggshells throughout this conversation. And everything Mike Nahum said is reasonable. He gave her an out. He said, here is an argument. Here is a reason to go get your kids vaccinated. It's still not a reason I would get my kids vaccinated for, but as far as the health director is concerned, if she has a rationale to present to the public for prescribing that children of a certain age get vaccinated, here's a reason that would be tough to countervail. Here's a rationale that on its face might make some sense. Of course, we would need some statistics then to make a comparative analysis that's proper. And so far, this is the best rationale I've heard yet. The response.
And I've shared this sentiment, and you're going to hear this a lot from public health and folks in healthcare. There is too much focus on the death rate.
False. Just false. This is the first time it's been brought up here. The mainstream media never talks about the death rate. Our updates from Dr. Jeremy Leffin, from Mayor Bass, from Governor Lamont, never once have I heard passing mention of death rates across the age groups. I've heard it when it comes to an overall. I've heard it when it comes to the elderly, but you never once hear it across age groups, and you never once hear mention of the difference in death rates, especially when it comes to kids. And also, of course, we're going to be talking about health outcomes during a presentation from the health director. And of course, death is going to take up the majority of that focus. It's death. Of course, this is going to be the outcome we're most concerned with. It's death. And not only is it death, just from an emotional appeal, if we're going to be making that, but it's the only outcome metric we have any real data on. So how the hell are we supposed to make decisions about risk outcomes, about risk calculations, which deal with outcomes, not just inputs? And by the way, cases don't tell you anything about outcomes. Outcomes tell you about outcomes. You don't look to when you're doing a risk calculation, right? You try to have a comparison of possible outcomes, right? We talked about this on the previous show. We talked about it on the show before. You have to look at competing interests, right? So when you do a proper risk calculation, not only are you saying what's the percentage likelihood of the outcome manifesting and the severity of the outcome, you have to weigh that against competing interests. So we have to do all that. So, and by the way, since we haven't talked about this at all, if we're talking about it too much, what are we talking about going to then, right? Well, we're going to go from not talking about it at all to what? What's less than not talking about it at all? Bringing it up here to point out it never gets talked about is not part of the tally of times it has or has not been brought up. And by the way, folks, we talked about this 100 times. We've talked about this on my show. We talked about it when I was working with the guys over at the Liberty Block. There's a million great reasons that we make general statements about the risk outcomes, the outcome risk. The risk of certain outcomes by looking at that single statistic. It's of course useful to make generalizations. It's of course useful to speak in the general. That's what a risk calculation is. And the reason we focus on death is because first things first, it's binary. There's no confusion as to what death is. If we're talking about an outcome being a broken bone, well, which bone? Where is that bone broken? How many times has it been broken? How seriously is it broken? Who has that broken bone? Because remember, when a 6-year-old breaks their hip, it's very different from when a 66-year-old breaks their hip. When I break my wrist at 23, it's very different from when I break my wrist when I'm 93, right? So, and that's just one reason we use death as a metric. When we talk about all of the other long-term outcomes, what do they even mean? When we're talking about, say, scarring of lung tissue, well, you get that with the common cold. So what exactly are we talking about with scarring tissue, with tissue scarring in the lungs? Well, when we ask that same question about death, what do you mean by death? Well, we mean dead. How is there any confusion on what dead is? And the other thing is that death is generally considered a goalpost, as in in terms of health outcomes, in terms of an actuarial review of risk calculations. There's really nothing beyond death to concern yourself with. It's not like, well, if we look at broken bones and when it comes to car crashes, well, what's worse than a broken bone? Like, it's true that in X percentage of car crashes, you wind up with a broken bone. But if that number is relatively low, well, or relatively high, I mean, what's the next thing beyond that, right? And that's why it's useful to have death as that statistic, because there's nothing to consider really beyond that. So if the risk of death is incredibly low, right? If the risk of dying by getting struck by lightning is super duper low, maybe you actually leave the home. Maybe you don't force your kids to walk around with lightning cages. And by the way, those other outcomes tend to scale with death. Again, this is a broad generalization, but when you have that statistic, it's easy to convey to people what that means. They know what it means when there's a really high morbidity with a certain input, let's say. When we have a viral pathogen that has a ridiculously high morbidity, then we can kind of tell how all of the long haulers, if you will, all of the conditions that would grant for a long hauler would tend to scale with that. It's not a perfect scaling, but the point is, as the risk of death tends to go up, so does the risk of the other outcomes, generally speaking. It gives us an understanding of the severity of the disease in this case to have at least that one outcome metric. And again, we've talked about this repeatedly in my scroll. What we're talking about here is the prescription of an abdication of responsibility to just ignore death statistics, because that's what we're talking about. The health outcomes are the health. So for us to just completely ignore that as coming from the health department is a complete abdication of responsibility. Cases, which we've been bombarded with, they tell you nothing about outcomes. And we mentioned this a million times, and we know that that's the case. The reason we know that what we care about is outcomes and not cases is because of HPV in college. If you send your kids to college, to a post-secondary education school, it's basically a 100% guarantee that at some point during those 4 years, they're going to test positive for HPV. So why aren't we burning down the entire post-secondary education system because of HPV? Because nobody dies from HPV. And if we get to a point where the risk of death from COVID is ridiculously low, let's say in a certain age category, then maybe we don't burn down the entire institution that surrounds them. The real reason that everyone knows, the real reason that we're not supposed to be talking about death rates is because when you talk about death rates, the case for forcing kids to mask up and or vaccinate just completely vanishes. This is a common tactic of the left and the Democrats. And the reason I'm bringing this up as a common tactic is because, well, we're going to get into that conversation in a moment, but I need to point that out because it's going to kind of allow us to infer some information from this entire exchange, which is the whole point of me doing this, having this conversation. So what do leftists and Democrats usually follow up everything I've just said with? Well, they predict, and what Mike Nahom has been saying tonight, they predictably go to the MMR vaccine fallacy. So what is Dr. By the way, the MMR vaccine fallacy is that Yeah, because it's mandatory that you get vaccinated for this thing that kills a ton of kids and has a much higher infection fatality rate than COVID. We should vaccinate for that. Well, okay, what if we had, then why aren't we pushing mandates for the flu? Because if we're just going to set a risk threshold of 0, why aren't we doing this with the flu? Why have we never done this with the flu? We all know the answer. And as far as the MMR vaccine fallacy is concerned, this is the thing you would predict from a common leftist perspective. So what does Director Morrissey do in following that up?
Your kids attended public school?
What?
Did your kids attend public school?
Yeah.
I'm assuming they were vaccinated for chickenpox, measles?
Yeah.
All right, so let's hold this thought for a second. If we were talking about the number of kids who were ill with COVID-19 and equated that to chickenpox or measles, it would be unacceptable. That's why we started
Because if you
making
were
it
dead
mandatory
kids.
for kids to get vaccinated for those childhood illnesses. Because the burden of the disease was so great, not just to children's health, children's mental health, but to the economy and the economics. Because if kids are sick at home, their parents are at home. And it's devastating not just to the child's long-term health, but to the economics of the community. When we're talking about COVID-19, it's a very similar conversation. So there's a statistic that I think it's now 250 kids a day are being hospitalized with COVID-19. We don't even get those kind of numbers, and we haven't for a long time with measles or chickenpox, but we still vaccinate that for that. More kids have died for COVID-19 than they ever have of chickenpox, but we vaccinate for that.
First things first, I find that hard to believe, but then maybe we shouldn't have to vaccinate with chickenpox. Maybe it's ridiculous to vaccinate against things that don't kill people. And we're going to come back to that in just a minute. But it would be unacceptable, as she mentions. It would be unacceptable because there would be way more dead kids. Because the infection fatality rate, the death rate that you don't want us to talk about, would be much higher. Reminder about HPV. Because if that was the case when we had a university in town, then Director Morrissey, your only thing that you should be talking about at the podium ever is shutting the entire school down permanently. Shutting it down permanently. Right? And further, what do you think the burden of the disease is and comes from? It's death. It's death. The burden of the disease is the outcome of the disease, is the death, right? You have to deal with that sort of thing. And as far as the economics is concerned, not to be crass, not to be cynical, but I mean, you've been fully on board with all the mandates that have utterly demolished the economy over the past, closing in on now 2 years. So I have a hard time believing this is coming from a position of good faith. And as far as chickenpox is concerned, folks know, yeah. So maybe we don't need the chickenpox vaccine, and also we don't mean. And by the way, this is a relatively new advent. When I was a kid, you know what we had? We had pox parties. That's how not serious chickenpox is to kids. Chickenpox is so unserious to kids that we had parties where parents would bring their kids over to an infected kid's house to deliberately give them chickenpox. That's how not serious it is with kids. And the reason we know it's not serious with kids is by the death rate. It's because when you get chickenpox as a kid, the likelihood of you dying is next to nothing. When you get chickenpox as an adult, it becomes a critical life-threatening situation, right? And that's why we had these pox parties, and they were incredibly effective. I went to a pox party. I think it was one of my cousins or my brother, I forget who it was, and that got it. And then, surprise, for the first time ever, since all of us have our birthdays in the winter, we had our half birthday in July or June or whatever it was. We've never in our lives had a half birthday party. But sure enough, as soon as one of us caught chickenpox, we got it. And again, the reason we were willing to do that with chickenpox and not measles, mumps, and rubella, by the way, for decades, we never did that with measles, mumps, and rubella because measles, mumps, and rubella kills kids. Because there's a death rate we can refer to, and that is commonly known and well accepted and well researched and well understood because we can look to the death rate, right? And just so you guys know about the vaccine, it's only been around for I want to say it's only been around for 15 to 20 years. It really hasn't been around for all that long, right? So I know 15 to 20 years seems like an eternity when it comes to COVID, which has been around for not even a year. Right? It's not even a year, right? But the point is that this is relatively new advent when chickenpox is something that we've known about for genuinely hundreds of years. So Here's why we actually get the chickenpox vaccines. Kids could spread it to adults. I already told you, kids are going to be fine. This is why we had pox parties, because kids are going to be fine. We wouldn't do this with measles, mumps, and rubella. We wouldn't do this with Ebola. We wouldn't do this with some unbelievably dangerous... We wouldn't do this with rabies. We sure as hell wouldn't do this with rabies, right? In fact, if your kid caught rabies and was showing signs of symptoms and was running around the schoolyard, foaming at the mouth, chasing kids down, you'd probably put a bolt in his brain. Because you know what the mortality rate is with rabies once the symptoms have onset? One. There are so few people that have survived the onset of symptoms with rabies that there's an entire Wikipedia stub devoted to those handful of people in all of human history that have survived it. Right? This is one of the oldest diseases we have great records of, rabies. And it's like a handful of people that have survived it. It's like 10 or 12 people in the history of humankind that have survived it, have survived the onset of symptoms. Right? So that's a situation where we would be probably putting a bullet in our own kids' brains because of how serious the risk of contraction is, because of how unbelievably serious the mortality rate is, because we can look to the death rate. And the other reasons we did the chickenpox vaccine is because it did provide at least some mitigation against adult onset shingles, which if you just get the chickenpox virus as a way to provide immunization against chickenpox, doesn't really provide that. And again, this all goes right back to Mike Nahum's original point, which you rejected, right? Again, this is just an argument for lightning cages. I've talked about it before. I've said it 100 times. If I've said it once, I've said it 100 to 100,000 times. There's no such thing as zero risk. The definition of the word risk means there's no such thing as zero risk. And this is what we're talking about. We're talking about another argument for lightning cages. There is technically a risk that your kids could die from getting struck by lightning on a sunny day. That risk is technically not zero. The odds of the monkeys typing scenario coming to fruition are not technically zero, even though it's something like if every proton ever to have existed and that will ever exist was a monkey at a typewriter, it would take something like 1 times 10 to like 120,000th number of universes in order for that to come to fruition if they were typing at something like 100 words per minute, which very few people type at. So again, you could just chalk this up. You could, this whole thing is something you could just chalk up if you're the health director to just talking to too much Ned Lamont, just listening to too much Ned Lamont. Like, I've only got one source of information. It's coming from Ned Lamont. And as the health director, you know what? I would forgive that. But
the conversation needs to move away from talking about death and talk about long-term disability and effects to families, economics. Because if you have parents out for 2 and 3 weeks of work, there is no federal protection. They can lose their jobs. When we talk about long-term effects, the number of families that I have personally talked to whose kids come home now insulin dependent, who come home with cardiovascular disease, we're talking about 6, 7, 8-year-olds who now have to follow up with cardio for the rest of their lives. There are things, death is a horrible thing for any parent to face for their child. But when you're talking about long-term health consequences, your vision for your child changes. It does. And the burden of the care and the expense of that is not something that's covered anywhere. The family has to cover that. And that's part of the conversation about why it's so important to get kids vaccinated. It's not just about death.
So this is just a pure injection of politics into this position. Not just into the conversation, but into the position itself. And I don't know if Ms. Morrissey actually realizes this, so this can be forgivable. But at the same time, this is just the injection of politics, and the politics here are revealed. The mention of federal protection for people who lose their job for using up too much sick time. Why would you make that mention? Who would make that mention? Who would think that the solution to people losing their jobs because of using up too much sick time is governmental interference? The complete misunderstanding of economics going on here. You wouldn't shut down an entire state for months if that was the case. If you seriously were concerned with actual economics, you wouldn't tell parents, hey, your kids aren't going to be going back to school. Your kids are going to be indefinitely not going back to school, and they're going back into the virtual classroom. So good luck finding daycare, right? And I've said it 100 times again. It's a shame that public education is being treated as just nothing more, in many cases, than government-funded daycare. But at the same time, when the kids go home, in many cases, you got to have daycare. 6-year-olds aren't going to just sit as a rule. I certainly would have not sit nicely in front of a computer screen and absorbing the way they would in a classroom, right? You don't have that physical presence of the human being in that room. Parents have said it a million times. And then when they're getting dumped on constantly with these constant changes as to what the policy is when it comes to the education, this is what we're talking about. I mean, the refusal to consider competing interests, like when we're talking about the prescription of mask wearing in certain situations. I've talked about it on the show when it comes to the prescription of mask wearing in town council meetings. I think what the message that is sending to the vaccine hesitant is don't get vaccinated. I think by taking off the masks in these town council meetings, you might actually convince more people to go get vaccinated, which might, if the vaccines work, if you're going to tell us the vaccines work and are the single most effective strategy towards, kicking COVID's ass, then what we should do is do everything we can to get more people vaccinated, which means that if taking off the masks at town council meetings, which are held in the giant E. Paul Martin room with vaulted ceilings, right, and excellent HVAC, and the fans going in a room where in almost every single meeting, absolutely everyone there is vaccinated, then maybe that would be a case where you would prescribe taking off the mask. But no, we're not talking about competing interests. Who out there who is the type of person? And this is a question to my audience. Who do you think is the type of person who would not talk about competing interests? Right? Who would not talk about the long-term health consequences of young children not seeing faces for years? Right? When we're talking about a zero risk calculation, then your 2-year-old should always be wearing a mask. You should always be wearing a mask. You should be, when it comes time to eat, masks should be worn. So good luck trying to cram food down your mouth when there's an object precluding that from happening. When it comes to your 2-year-old, they should be wearing it in the bath, which means you should be waterboarding your 2-year-old if we're going to have a zero risk calculation. Who are the people that are making these prescriptions? Again, what are those rates when it comes to kids? All of the things that Lisa mentioned, what are those long-term health consequence rates when it comes to kids? We're not getting them. According to the CDC, it's next to nothing, but we're not getting them in any of these meetings. We're not getting any of these rates. Mike Nahom asked about these rates, and instead we got absolute numbers. Instead, we got an appeal to emotion. We didn't get an answer, a response from these rates. Now, I'm not going to suggest what the motivation was for not getting those responses, but again, this is kind of piling up. And for the record, as far as the long-term health consequences are concerned, death is a long-term health consequence. If we were to be playing a video game, right? If life was somehow a video game and you could assign some video game score to your health, right? We could say 100 points of health. If somebody is dead, how many points of health did they get? Zero? And while that game is continuing to go on, what's that number? 0? A year from now, that number is 0. Years from now, that number is 0. Years from then, its number is 0. If we were to graph this as a curve, right? If we were to graph this as a curve, I'm going to try to do this for everybody, right? And we're going to start, right, like here. Excuse me, this is all backwards. We're going to start here with that 100 health score. And we got death. 0, right? What's the area under that graph compared to somebody who's at, say, 80, right? Death is a long-term health consequence. This is something that we consider in the long term. While somebody is pushing up daisies, if we were to, again, assign a score, in some way find some way to create a metric for your overall health, right? That metric would be 0 for eternity. I would say eternity is long term. And as far as the statement about it's not just about death, correct. It's about keeping up a clearly politically motivated fear-mongering narrative so certain policy can get pushed that otherwise couldn't and wouldn't. And speaking of which, earlier this week, the Connecticut Senate and House passed an extension of Ned Lamont's quote-unquote emergency powers for a 6th time. And they did that with huge margins. So this is the result of the vote in the House, and the Senate result was really not any better. This is the result from the Senate. In the House, the score was 80-60, and I think it was roughly 11 non-voting. And the scoreboard you see here is incorrect. But again, this is a landslide in favor of all of this. And speaking of the House, if we're going to go back to the House just for a minute, good on Billy Mo Buckby. This is my representative. I've highlighted him here. Good on you, Billy Mo, for doing the right thing. Good on you, Billy Mo, for voting against having a king. Good on Craig Minor, who is my senator, for voting against, again, having a king for life, right? And good on Congressman Rosa Rabimbas, who's the one that actually posted all of this on Facebook. You guys should really give her a follow. During these entire debates, she was absolutely
The
killing it.
conversation needs to
Hold
move
on.
away
Sorry,
from talking
folks.
about death and
Sorry,
talk about
folks.
long-term disability and effect.
It would not be an episode of the Mike Sennello Show without a technical difficulty. So let me drop a link into the comments section here. There's our link. So you guys can follow Rosa. I'm going to put that on YouTube too, so you guys can follow her on Facebook. She's actually pretty awesome, and she was absolutely killing it on the House floor. And she's the one that actually posted these pictures that I got of the results of those elections. So you guys should actually give her a follow. Rosa, I've really been loving what you've been doing. Her Facebook feed is pretty awesome too. She's pretty darn based. So Rosa, this is my formal invitation for you to come onto the show and talk about everything that you've experienced here in the House during your tenure. And the long and short of what's been happening in the House and Senate is that we have a king for life. And I can't wait until our king for life, Ned Lamont, uses COVID as an excuse to extend his powers into the election processes. It's this vote is an explicit, direct abdication of the powers duly entrusted exclusively to our legislature, which should be the only body capable of legislating. Powers in the general, by the way, that are disturbingly broad, that have been handed off to Ned Lamont. This is why we refer to him as King Ned. Because these powers, by the way, these requests are coming from Ned himself. If he believed in the separation of powers, if he believed in the co-equal division of government, then he wouldn't even be making these requests. If he honestly believed that maybe he honestly believes there's some sort of emergency that's going on. But the point is, if he does, then we should have a very, very high bar for these extensions. And that's for the first extension. And that bar should increase exponentially, not linearly, every time it's requested, every time it is granted. So I'll just, to show you what I mean, this is what I mean by a graph of that bar should be growing exponentially, right? So right here you have 1. That's the first time, I guess. If we can imagine that as a really, 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 really high bar for the first extension of emergency powers, then the next extension, I mean, this should be a major, serious critical emergency, and that's 3, right? Like the bar here increases by more than the previous time every time we do this. So to me, at this point, with the 6th extension, yeah, there better be Mongols raping, not just knocking on the doorsteps, but raping and pillaging the entire state with full extermination of the populace just hours or days away, right? We should have Genghis Khan in here and slaughtering not my fellow nutmeggers by the 1,000. So we talked about competing interests. There's a reason people are running out of the state, and we talked about this before, right? This is one of them. Right, the fact that we don't have any oversight over these emergency powers, with the fact that we're abdicating legislative responsibilities onto what has become a king. And the reason I say king for life, of course, is because these are landslide victories. These are landslides. There's just no hope that when I was watching Rosa give her speech on the floor, when they were talking about, when the House was talking about extending these emergency powers, and she was killing it, it was depressing. Because she was killing it and the outcome was already decided. We already knew that in a landslide, these powers are going to be extended. I have no idea what the limiting principle is here. I have no idea what the conditions for not extending these powers is right now from the Democrats in Hartford. Right? So, and since they're just perpetually going to outnumber Republicans because of city dwellers, because of a handful of locations that account for the greatest number of the greatest population, I mean, I don't know what to say. I don't know what to say about all this. But again, This is just one of the reasons people are running out of the state. We talked about this before, but yeah, we just got our report card for our fiscal rankings, and here we are, folks. We care about economics here in this state. Dead last. If you guys want to see what the report card looked like, here's our report card. This just came out just a few weeks ago. This is a report card. F. We got an F. We have, in terms of our fiscal solvency, we are the least fiscally solvent state in the entire country, right? And we were only, of course, if you want to know where we were before, we were marginally better at 49th in 2018. So I guess things were marginally better before, but yeah, now we're only getting worse. And here's the Mercatus report. Sorry, that is the Mercatus report. This is from the Mercatus Center. Excuse me. So yeah, so that's where we are. We're at a point now where we're talking about having a king for life instead of a governor in the state. We're at a point now where there's just no point in having a House and a Senate, no point in having a legislature in general, right? As the theme of the show goes, keep electing Democrats. And again, I don't even know how to respond to all this. Like what do you do in the face of all this? We don't even agree that the legislature should legislate and not the executive. I mean, we're at a point where there is just no agreement between the sides. There's just no common ground, nothing to share with these two sides. And for the record, we fought as far as the abdication of power, as far as the fact that we disagree on whether or not the legislature should be the sole body that legislates and the separation of powers. The fact that we disagree on the fact that we should be just endlessly extending, legislative authority to our governor, to a king for life. The fact that we disagree on this notion is something that we fought a war and founded our whole country over. And reminder, this coming from the Constitution state. One side is okay with rule by dictation, and they utterly dominate this state. So, and again, this grouping is extremely highly concentrated geographically. So what is the actual response to this? Well, if we're going to stand by our convictions, then, I joked about this before. But folks, maybe it's time for this. Maybe it's time for us to just do Free State of Housatonic. Let me introduce to those who have never seen this before, the Free State of Housatonic, are the most based and red-pilled, towns in this area who have been consistently based and red-pilled to just leave, to just form a 51st state. If AOC is perfectly okay with adding more states for no reason, here's adding a state for an actual reason. And that is that, there is a clear bifurcation of fundamental and general principles on which the people of the nutmeggers in Connecticut stand. To me, I don't know what is actually bonding the people in my new Free State of Housatonic to the rest of the people. If we're going to have all of these states introduced against their will, right? If the Democrats are okay with Puerto Rico becoming a state, with DC becoming a state for obviously purely partisan political rationales, how about we introduce a 51st state to the Union that has a rationale for doing it? So again, folks, I don't know how to respond to all of that. And I was joking before when I mentioned the Free State of Housatonic. Now let's do it. Now let's get the ball rolling on that. If you're with me, let's have that conversation. And at the very least, you know what we can do here? It's just a few weeks away, election in November. So as we know, in this town, as we bring it back into New Milford, it's shaped up. We already know who the mayoral candidates are going to be. It's going to be incumbent Republican Mayor Pete Bass versus challenger Democrat Ted Hine. So let's talk about Ted Hine for a little bit, because we've already talked about Pete for a long time. We have a standing record with Pete. He's been the incumbent. We have something to go on. So a lot of people have asked me about Ted Hine and have asked for research on Ted Hine because nobody seems to know anything about him. And he's come in as a complete unknown. And as a result of that, I can't help but compare him to Tom O'Brien in the previous Democrat candidate for election in 2019. So as far as I have yet to, so when I say compare him to O'Brien, we're going to do a bit of a compare and contrast, where O'Brien had absolutely served on town committees, town commissions, and where he attended a ton of these meetings and where he was actually quite visible. I've yet to see that from Ted Hine. I've yet to see Ted Hine attend one town council meeting. I've yet to see Ted Hine sign up for any of the boards or commissions. So this isn't me saying he should. I'm just saying if you're comparing his candidacy to Tom O'Brien comes into this, with excellent name recognition before announcing his candidacy. So this is why when I call Ted Hine a complete unknown, again, it's hard to not compare him to the previous Democrat candidate, who, by the way, if we're going to compare, in both cases right now, I have no reason to denigrate Ted Hine's character. Just like with Tom O'Brien, that entire time I had no rationale to denigrate his character. So what do we actually have to go by? Well, the thing that, as far as I can tell, the thing that we can go by that provides the most direct insight into Ted Hine is his website. So we can go into Ted Hine's website. This is tedhineformayor.com. And we can, so this is his home. This is the homepage. We can click on platform and get some ideas for his policy. And his policy, transformational change for a better New Milford. Well, considering how unbelievably popular Pete Bass is, I really do wonder specifically what that change is. Taxes. Ted believes in ending the trend of surplus budgets with a return to balanced budgeting. By ending wasteful spending and padding within the budget, more money can be left where it belongs, with the citizens of New Milford. Now, as far as I'm concerned, I think that's because there are legal ramifications for going over budget. And it's much more difficult from a legal perspective to make a request for funding than to be a little bit over. This is the exact reason the Board of Education is always over budget. Now, the Board of Education is always over budget by not all that much, to be honest. So this is why I consider the Board of Ed being over budget every single year, just not news, right? Like they have a legal obligation to be not over budget, under budget every year. They have basically a legal obligation to be under budget. They have a legal obligation to actually meet their budget and not to exceed it. There may be something similar with that with the town. So as far as the wasteful spending is concerned and padding is concerned, that's just government. Like to me, that's just a non-issue. More money can be left where it belongs with the citizens of New Milford. So is he proposing a lower tax rate? Because the thing that's accounting for 2/3 of the budget is the Board of Education side of the budget. So if you wanted to slash budgets, that would be the place to do it, just on the where the money is being spent. Traffic along Route 7202 has long been the scourge of downtown New Milford, increasingly so in recent times. Ted plans to rekindle the major works plans, which have lost focus under Republican administrations. Ted is calling for the return of a program to overhaul the flow of traffic in the area, giving much-needed relief to downtown. This includes a plan to implement structured preventative maintenance for the roads to replace the current highly expensive model of quote-unquote wait and repair. So again, I'd love to hear what Ted means specifically by that, but hey, at least here we have something that is at least related to a policy prescription. So folks, the reason I'm doing this isn't to dunk on Ted. This is because a ton of people have come to me and said, who is Ted? What is he running on? What is his platform? What can we expect from a Ted Hine mayorship? I don't know what the word is for that. What can we expect for what a Ted Hine in the office of the mayor would look like? And that's why I'm doing this, just to go over all this. Now, teaching. School budget proposals have been continually cut under Republican administrations. Hey, positive here. He says school budget proposals have been continually cut. The proper word would be reduced. But this is as close as we've ever gotten to a Democrat candidate who talks about that process correctly. This puts pressure on both our facilities as well as our teachers to perform their sacred duty of preparing our children to compete in an ever-increasing competitive academic arena. So I wonder what his response is to the explosion of homeschooling in the state, which we talked about 2 episodes ago. In fact, I think we talked about it last episode, how homeschooling in Connecticut, the number of students who are being withdrawn from the public schooling system in Connecticut has increased by roughly 600%. Not the number, but the rate of increase is going up by 600%. So yeah, and that was last year. I can't wait to see what the data is for this year. Yeah, so the explosion of homeschooling. This makes it difficult to contend even against local schools. This is critical given, I don't know why we're competing with local schools. This is critical given the relatively lower compensation paid to New Milford teachers, particularly given the volatile nature of COVID-19. Well, if we expose things to market influences. Well, all right. Transparency. As a lifelong resident of New Milford, Ted is familiar with some of the more covert aspects of town politics. Just as a brief aside, his campaign has been highly focused on him being a lifelong resident. In fact, I do actually have some of his campaign literature, and that is on his door signs. The mentioning of the fact that he's the first sentence, Ted is a lifelong resident of Milford whose family dates back to the early 1700s. So I would say Republicans are actually worse about this than Democrats are, generally speaking, but I kind of don't care how long you've been in New Milford. What I care about is your policy prescription. So, if we shouldn't be doing this with Ted, and we shouldn't be doing this with any of our candidates, be they a Republican, Democrat, unaffiliated, which make up the largest voting bloc, or a third party, such as Libertarian. That said, with the covert aspects of town politics, I wonder what those are. So, Ted, this would be a great opportunity for you to come on the show and tell us what those are. These are often hot-button issues. We don't have one listed here. Subject to little transparent dealing and much back-alley cronyism. Wow, that's a serious allegation. Again, Ted, this should be a great opportunity for you to come on to my show and tell me exactly what you mean by that. One such project, so here's an example of what he's talking about, Ted hopes to shine the light of truth on, is the John Pettibone Community Center. The future of the center has often been shrouded in ambiguity and a lack of communication. As a center of community activity, Ted believes its purpose and future should be apparent and open for debate amongst the community at large. So for me, I want to go over this too, because for me, depending on which desktop I'm watching, the page is actually somewhat broken. So I've gone over this too for those of you who are watching this, say the way that I've been that are watching this, and are experiencing the problems that I've been experiencing on his website with the platform's broken text. So now you guys get to see all of that. If you guys didn't get to see that as well as I was hoping you guys would, do reach out to me. I've got the text copied on a notepad file, so you guys can have that. So again, Ted comes into this with very little name recognition. And this isn't to denigrate him or his platform or his character. I think I wonder if he's a lame duck candidate in terms of what the DTC is doing. Maybe they're sitting on this so that they can wait for, an opportunity to, let's say, once Pete Bass leaves, because he's enormously popular with Republicans, Democrats, and unaffiliateds and Libertarians alike. So I don't know if that's the case. It would be one hell of a slight if Democrats were actually doing that. The DTC leadership was doing that here. So with that said, Ted, this is a great opportunity, as I've previously mentioned, to come onto the show and do our interview, just like I've done with Pete Bass, just like I did with Democrat Lisa Hita, just like I did with Pete Helmus for the Board of Education, just like I've done with numerous candidates on this channel and on various other channels across the internet. So this is me extending to you, Ted Hine, a formal invitation to come onto my show and have a chat, have an interview about your candidacy. The way I do this is the same format that I've been doing before. 1 hour, we do it live, and we do live Q&A. That holds your feet to the fire, that holds my feet to the fire in case I'm asking softball questions. And of course, if you come onto my show as a guest on my show, you will be treated as a guest of my show. Right? So that means civility and decency. It doesn't mean softball questions. It doesn't mean I won't be asking hard questions. It doesn't mean the audience won't be asking hard questions. But it does mean just that, being treated as a guest. So formal invitation to Ted to come on to the show to have that interview. Now, that said, I did actually get the opportunities to give Ted the invitation in person to his face, which is, I think, the most appropriate place to do that at Riverfest today, which is I wish I had some more time to actually go. Instead, I was working on things in the office here and out in the field doing what I've been doing. So speaking of what I've been doing, and especially on this channel, since I just want to let you guys know what's coming up. What's coming up is the thing that is going to be coming up soonest is the meet and greet for the RTC candidates, which is happening at the Abbey's, on Wednesday, October 13th that's going to be running from 5 to 7 p.m. The PTO is also hosting a Meet the Candidates event. That is on Wednesday, October 20th, 2021 at 7 p.m. That's at Sarah Noble. Yeah, I know, folks, at the bottom, masks will be required. I know it's a bummer, but if you're a candidate, you should be going to these events. If you are interested in getting to know the candidates, you should be going to these events. I sure as heck will be going to these events. And that helps everybody keep informed on who the candidates are. And speaking of that, we have some candidates for public office that we've already lined up interviews with. Link will be coming soon. I've lined up our interview with Eric Hansel, who is running for the Board of Education. Link to that interview will be coming soon. That is happening. Get your pens and pencils out. Next Sunday at 7 p.m. on this channel. Eric Hansel running for Board of Ed next Sunday at 7 p.m. And I'm working on the interviews with the mayoral candidates, and I've already sent the invitations out to both. And here's the big news, folks. This Wednesday at 7 p.m., after Pete Bass does his Wednesday show, Pete Bass will be coming on to lead these series of interviews. So, folks, that's Wednesday the 13th Wednesday the 6th at 7 p.m. on this channel. I'll have a link built for everybody. Go ahead and share it when I get that link out. And I'll be sharing it with everybody when that link does come. Please do come and bring your questions, because I want the opportunity here to start the ball rolling on these interviews on a good foot. I really want to get some great hard-hitting questions from the audience. So Democrats, if you're watching, this is your opportunity to gain direct access to Pete Bass. This is your opportunity to hide behind the protection of the glass, of the internet, of your monitor, and ask some brutally, brutally hard questions. So again, Pete Bass coming on for an interview this Wednesday at 7 p.m. after he does his show. And the final thing as we're wrapping things up here, because we are way over on time. But the final thing that we're to talk about is that, and I've gotten this unconfirmed, I'm not going to actually share the thing that I got because I got it through Messenger and I haven't been able to find the posting of this. Walter Bear has accepted write-ins. So if you guys want to write in Walter Bear's name this year because he has been left off the ballot by Democrats, I'm not going to get into the motivations. But this is somebody who is a Democrat, who is a well-respected Democrat in our community, even amongst Republican ranks. He's again, yet another candidate whose character I have no reason to denigrate. And he was the candidate in 2019 the Democrat candidate, that had the most votes of any Democrat, and even beat out DTC chair Mary Jane Lundgren by roughly 200 votes. And again, this year he's been left off the ballot by the Democrats. I don't want to get into the motivations behind that, why that's the case. But the point is that he has come out, and as far as I can tell, I can't confirm it, but so as far as I can tell, Walter has come out and said that he welcomes the invitation to write his name in. So that is where we are. That is the world we live in. Keep electing Democrats. So let me get to your questions. Let's see if we have any comments coming in. Nothing in from YouTube. And I don't have anything in here from Facebook. So that's been it for tonight's show. Like I said, save the date. Wednesday, 7 p.m. We're going to be bringing on Mayor Bass. Next week, we're not going to have a normal show. We're just going to be interviewing Eric Hansel for Board of Ed. So save those dates. And until the next time, it's been Mike signing off. Good night, folks.